Hello everyone, and welcome to the September edition of the Farmer Supply Association Agriculture Report. I'm Randy Kopechka, agronomist with Farmer Supply Association. Well, September is here, and that means harvest season is here. The time of the year we've been waiting for all year long, putting all the work into making the crop and then seeing what you got out there. It certainly hasn't been the start that we had hoped for. You know, the weather's kind of dictated things the last couple of weeks, but things are getting better now. Hurricane Laura decided to make an appearance here on August the 27th and 28th, and with Laura came heavy rains, high straight line winds, and also some spin up tornadoes which caused damage around here. So all those things kind of hurt us. And lo and behold, right after Laura left, we had a cold front come knock on our door, and it decided to stay around. So that cold front, we dealt with it from August the 29th to September 2nd. So all in all, we had 7 straight days with rainfall, and plus we had those high winds associated with Laura, so we've got some issues to deal with. The things that can happen with these kind of weather events, main thing we deal with is rice lodging. And if you look in this field behind me, you can see where this rice is laying flat on the ground, and that's what we call lodging, when it's laying flat on the ground like that. It hasn't been as bad as we thought it was going to be. When we heard about the hurricane coming, we thought we'd have a lot more lodging than we did, but where we've got lodging, it's severe, as you can see in this field behind me. Lodging does a lot of things. It slows harvest. You've got to slow down to try to pick up the rice, so you've just got to go slower to start with. There's a lot of harvest loss. The grain just simply won't make it to the combine hopper because a lot of things can happen to it from the time that combine gets to it until that grain would be in the hopper. So you have a lot of harvest loss. You also have a lot of quality issues. That grain is a lot of times laying on the ground in that wet condition, so things can happen to it. We can have milling issues with it. We can also have several other issues with it. We can have sprouting of that seed, sprout coming out of the grain. So there's a lot of issues that we can have when we have rice lodged like this and laying on wet ground. We also have a lot of soybean issues, and we're not in the soybean field, but I want to touch on soybeans just a little bit. We also had some lodging, and not so much flat lodging with the soybeans, but we have a lot of leaning, where the plants are leaned over, getting close to the ground, and we can have a lot of issues with that. A lot of times those soybeans on the bottom side, they're closer to the ground, don't fill out as well when we have that kind of leaning and lodging, so that can be an issue. And even probably a bigger issue that we've seen in a lot of soybean fields, a lot of our flat fields, our fields that don't drain well, the clay fields and those kind of fields, we're having a lot of issues with oxygen depletion in those fields. We've been 7 days with either water standing or pure mud, and the oxygen, the soybean plant can't get oxygen to the roots because, you've got mud and water there, and it's an anaerobic environment, so you will not have oxygen getting to those roots. So those plants get sick. You'll see them get a light green color, you'll see them turn yellow, and then you'll see them die. So we're seeing a lot of that in low parts of fields. A lot of the yellow beans that are dying, and a lot of times you'll see beans that are just a light green and they're really sick too. And a lot of times these beans that are affected like this they'll go ahead and die. They won't fill out that seed, and even if they do live, they won't fill out properly like they ought to. So we'll have a yield loss from our soybeans as well. When you have issues like this, our farmers are looking for a way to maybe overcome some of this. So what they'll do, they'll be looking for things they can do to maybe help make a harvest a little bit easier. And one of the things they'll do is use of harvest aids. We're talking with rice, we're talking about sodium chlorate. With soybeans, we're talking about gramoxone generally. And these will help dry the foliage up on these plants and make harvest maybe a little more efficient, a little quicker and easier. So a lot of things going on with that. So I wanted to touch on the use of harvest aids in both rice and soybeans and what we need to be thinking about there. There's several rules of thumb on rice, and rice is critical because we have quality issues that can occur. We have plant issues, lodging, other things that can occur. So we really got to be careful and do it right with rice. Some of the guidelines include moisture, grain moisture. You want the grain moisture to be no higher than 25 when you put the salt out. And with the hybrids, we want it 23 or less, and the reason the hybrids is a little bit lower is because the hybrid panicle is generally quite a bit longer, so we have a more varying degree of moisture on that panicle, so we've got to let it get a little bit lower to make sure everything's below 25 when we do salt it, so we don't have damage from that. So that's kind of the rule of thumb on the high end of the moisture. On the low end, we want no lower than an 18% moisture in general. especially with the medium grains like Titan. Titan's prone to have milling issues, so you don't want it to get over dried. So on medium grains, don't let that moisture be below 18 when you salt. Sometimes you can play with long grains and fudge just a little bit on that, but certainly not with the medium grains. The next thing is harvest. After you salt it, you want to get out there and get it harvested pretty quickly, no more than 5 days. If you let that plant sit out there more than 5 days after being salted, several things can happen. You can have shattering, grain loss off the head. You can also have the plant get weaker. The stalk gets weaker when it dries up, and you can have lodging. You're more prone to have lodging. And also you can have milling issues because the plant just gets too dry and those grains get too dry. So lodging and shattering and milling issues can all occur if you don't harvest within 5 days. So that's why we want the harvesting done within 5 days. One other thing, if you're putting the salt out and that moisture's kind of borderline low, say under 20 maybe, then you might want to cut that salt rate in half. Normally we go a gallon of a 5-pound sodium chlorate, but you can go that maybe cut back to half a gallon if that moisture is borderline, so you don't again get that over drying, which can be a big issue when you use salt. So salt can be a good thing, but we got to do it right, and we don't want to get over dried. With soybeans, we use gramoxone to help dry up that plant and speed maturity. So the main thing on that is we want separation of that soybean within that pod from that membrane. So there's a white membrane in that pod. You want the seed to be separated from that membrane and from that pod wall, and at that point you've got all the weight you're going to get in that seed, and you can go ahead and put the gramoxone out. So that's the rule of thumb kind of with the harvest aids on soybeans. Again, not as many critical issues with soybeans as there are with rice. So that's that harvest aid part of it. I'm still getting a few questions about insects and in our soybeans and rice. I wanted to touch on that. We're pretty much past that insect problem time of the year, but there's still a couple of issues I'm seeing out there. Number one, if you've got some late rice stink bugs have been building up in the later rice. Last month's program, you may remember I talked about, it was such a low stink bug number year, but I warned everybody that we need to watch this later rice because numbers could build up, and that's what we're seeing. So if you've got some later rice that's still pretty green out there, you still need to be scouting for stink bugs. And if you reach that threshold of 10 stink bugs per 10 sweeps, and the rice is still, not 60% of the head turned straw colored already, then you can still get significant damage. So again, the rule of thumb, you want at least 60% of that panicle to be straw colored, and low numbers of stink bugs at that time. If you've got high numbers at that point, you probably want to go ahead and clean them up. But if you have low numbers at that point and 60% of the head being straw colored, you can go ahead and terminate insecticide applications on your rice. So hopefully we're getting close to the end of that period, but there's still some green rice out there. Soybeans, I think the corn earworm run is over. Most people had to spray one time, or a lot of people had to spray one time, but really I think that is over with. We're catching very few moths now, and I think that's probably behind us. One thing you might still need to consider is stink bugs in our soybeans, and we don't have that big of an issue in our north part of our farmer supply area, but like in Cherry Valley and some areas down there, we still have some major issues with stink bugs. So at times, if you've got stink bug issues, go ahead and go to growth stage 6.5 when that plant starts turning color and we get that separation from that pod. And if you can get to that point, then you should be all right with your stink bug issues. So that's kind of where we're at right now. Again, the weather has gotten a lot better over the last 5 or 6 days for harvest, and hopefully we can get several more weeks of that. If we do, hopefully we can get this crop out of the field and be ready for winter time. So got any questions on any of this, you can contact me at Farmer Supply Association, and this has been Randy Kopechka with your September report.